Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia, and I am so glad to see all of you here, and I also want to extend a special welcome to those of you watching on live stream. We are very excited to introduce this first in a new conversation series at Columbia on awakening our democracy. And we're especially glad that we have so many co-sponsors from across the university who are here today and with us. You can find their names in your programs and on our website. It's an ever-growing list. And what it helps show is the wide range of groups across Columbia that are very interested in engaging these important questions. We also have a terrific panel that I will introduce in just a moment. But I want to say a word about the series. Awakening Our Democracy is a new conversation series at Columbia, which focuses on race, ethnicity, disparities, justice, and other pressing issues of our day. The idea for this series grew out of conversations since the Office of University Life's founding last January, conversations with students, faculty, and administrators. And the idea behind this Awakening Our Democracy series is to expand the conversation to include more of us throughout the university and invite and encourage all members of the university community to engage with the ideas that we're talking about from the robustly pluralistic perspectives that Columbia brings to these issues. As part of this, we ask and invite you to continue the conversation in the future, both in person with each other and also on the Office of University Life's website. There's a special section on the website called Ideas and Action. You can find the website at universitylife.columbia.edu, and there you will find special selections suggested by each of our panelists and our moderator today, and a place to offer your own ideas as well, so please check that out. Today's discussion, as you know, is on the American dream, immigration, and belonging, and we have wonderful discussants with us today. Our moderator, Duarte Geraldino, is a national correspondent for Al Jazeera, where he has focused on the immigration debate in the United States, including extensive exploration into the social and economic impacts of America's changing demographics. Van Tran is an assistant professor of sociology here at Columbia. Perhaps some of you have been in his very popular seminar, Immigrant New York. He also is the faculty organizer of the Race, Ethnicity, and Migration Workshop, and his work focuses deeply on ethno-racial equality in the United States. Next to Professor Tran is Negin Farsad. She was selected as a TED Fellow for her work in social justice comedy. And although we don't yet have a major or a recognized major in social justice comedy at Columbia, who knows what is to come? Negin is a SIPA alumna. She directed and produced the feature film The Muslims Are Coming, which features Jon Stewart and other comedians, actors, and journalists. Next to Negin is Cesar Vargas. He is the co-director of the Dream Action Coalition and New York State's first undocumented lawyer. Cesar is a nationally recognized leader in immigration reform and an advocate for the DREAM Act before Congress and in many other forums. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you very much for being here today. Again, I want to encourage all of you to check out the writings and the videos and other clips that they have recommended, which you can find on the University Life website. Thank you again for being here today, engaging in this conversation with us, and I'll turn it over to Duarte.
Thank you guys for being here. Give them a round of applause. When I was invited to take part in this event, I was really encouraged by the whole notion of immigration and belonging. Over the last 2 years here in America, we've had some extraordinary things happen. And I've been involved in covering the Black Lives Matter uprisings, the immigration struggle, and the policy changes that have come with that. And one of the things that both have in common is that they are about crossing borders, some very real, others social, and that involves a lot of clashes. And sometimes those clashes are violent, sometimes they're deadly, sometimes they're very, very polite, but no less profound. And if you're here today, you are part of that self-selected group that is bearing witness to it and actively taking part in it. Now, one little anecdote I'll tell you. I was in Colorado about 2 years ago for a conference, and one of my colleagues, an African-American woman, said, we should go up to the mountains. She says, it's not very diverse up there, but it's beautiful. We're driving up the mountain, and the view, maravilloso. I mean, it was fantastic. We spent the day there, and we're having dinner at this new American restaurant, very typically American. And we became fast friends with this older white couple. They must have had 30 years on us. And throughout this conversation, they said, yeah, we've traveled all over the world. We love diversity. We have exotic foods because it's the spice of life. This is what we do. And toward the end of the meal, they said, you're going to love it up here. And I'm thinking, well, I can't wait to start coming up to here more often. And then the husband leans in and says to me, the only thing you're not going to find up here is a lot of ethnic food. And I'm thinking, and I look at my dinner mate, oh my God, I've just spent an hour with this couple. What does this mean? And he says, you're not going to get it up here because this is not the culture up here. To which I respond to him, well, to me, this is ethnic food. This is as exotic and strange and unique as what you're saying. And it was that sort of clash, that moment, where we're looking at our normative values and what it means to be American in that very second. Now, that's a very polite instance of it, but it happens very, very often. Our panel, they deal with this issue in a lot of different ways, and I want to dive straight into it because folks deal with comedy, law, research. Just want to get a big up to Negin, her big victory today. I'm not sure if you know, but courts ruled in her favor. So normally I would start in this direction, but I want to start with you, Negin, right now. So you use comedy in order to deal with issues of belonging and immigration. If you could address that, but also just talk about this victory.
Yeah, so just really quickly about, for those of you who don't know about this case, about a year ago, there was like a bigoted group that was putting anti-Muslim posters around the MTA subway system, and that sees, over 5 million people a day. So it's like, you're really getting your anti-Muslim message out when you do that. And I got super annoyed, and I was like, oh, what should we do? We should, see what the minimum ad buy is for the MTA, which is $20,000 for those of you who are in the market, and put up our own ads, but delightful ads, which are also, I made this movie called The Muslims Are Coming. You can see it on Netflix. We mentioned it in the intro, and so we would be kind of doing these ads, promoting the movie, and they would be really delightful ads. Stuff like, for example, one of them said, "The ugly truth about Muslims: they have great frittata recipes," or like one that said, "Facts about Muslims. Fact number 1: they invented the concept of a hospital. Fact number 2: grown-up Muslims can do more push-ups than baby Muslims. Fact number 3: Justin Timberlake was an invention of Muslims." So these are the kind, and then on the bottom it said one of those is true. I think all 3 of them are true. But so these are the kinds of ads that we were making. We worked with the MTA for over 5 months. They looked at absolutely every detail of these posters. Little known fact: you cannot use the word poop in an MTA poster. You also can't use the word penis. So that took out at least half of what we wanted to talk about. But we worked with all of their kind of rigorous, ridiculous standards, and then our posters were set to go on a particular Monday in April, and then the Wednesday after that, our posters still hadn't gone up. We were like, what's going on? The MTA gives us a call. They're like, there's a policy change. We no longer are accepting any politically disputed material in the MTA subway system, and your material is politically disputed. Now, I don't know what has happened, in recent decades to make frittatas such a hot button political issue, but somehow all of our stuff, all of our jokes were seen as overly political, and so we decided to sue them. And just to be clear here, we're talking about a couple of dirtbag comedians decided to take on the MTA, we filed a thing, they filed a thing, we filed another thing. It went back and forth like this in a very exciting legal process, and finally, yesterday, the decision came down that we won. So, in fact, dirtbag comedians ruled the day, and what was really exciting is that the judge basically said, just saying the word Muslim is not political. Like we haven't gotten to that point yet. We're just uttering it is political, and so it was a really important victory. Sorry that took me so long.
Good stuff. Congratulations. So, Professor Tran, a lot of your students are here. How do you use research to really empower and inform the discussions about immigration and belonging?
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm delighted to be here on this panel. Thank you to Professor Suzanne Goldberg and the Office of University Life for putting together this event. I think that the conversation that we're having couldn't be more timely, especially in light of the fact that this week we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Immigration Act of 1965, which brought to our country, our city, our university, and our classroom the very diversity that we see here in the audience. In terms of my teaching and research, I try very much to convey the sense that immigration is here and will be here with us for a long, long time. We have two choices to make. One, we could embrace the ethno-racial cultural diversity that we have among us, or we could choose to resist the changes that are happening, not just here in New York City, but also across the world. In terms of engagement, I do, obviously, I'm a professor, so the best part of this job is to basically ask your students to think differently about the problems and challenges of our time. And I do that by pushing them above and beyond the places and spaces of Morningside Heights. So in my sermon on Immigrant New York, there is one assignment and one only, and that is you must go beyond the gate of Columbia to engage with the immigrant communities across the city. So our assignment is basically go to an immigrant community, observe, document, and report on social life. In addition to what you observe how you are reacting to what you see emotionally and culturally. To what do you find appealing, and to whom and what do you find that you're recoiling inward because of the fact that you might be unfamiliar with and uncomfortable with those cultural and social differences. And what I find is that a lot of my students embrace this challenge wholeheartedly, and secondly, very quickly, they came back glowing with insights about our city that they otherwise would not be able to see. And through these moments of interactions, and we can say more about this throughout this conversation, I'm hoping that we're opening a window into a dialogue and an opportunity for actual engagement with differences in a way that would move our community and our country forward that is more inclusive and more welcoming, not just to immigrants, but to all types of differences, cultural, social, linguistic, and religious differences that we face today in our society.
Bravo. We turn to Cesar. You occupy such a unique position. So you are a lawyer, and you are an expert in a system that literally says that you shouldn't be here right now. How do you deal with that seeming contradiction?
I think for me, one of the how I really describe that whole experience is I actually go very often to a lot of naturalization ceremonies. That's where pretty much newly immigrants who are, have gone through the whole process are able to get the citizenship, and they make the swearing ceremony to, oath of allegiance to the U.S. And I go often to those places to remind myself, not to remind myself that, I'm not a U.S. citizen, I don't have voting rights, but to remind myself that one day I will be there. One day I will be there, but I'm going to fight and earn my way to become a citizen. And, despite the fact that sometimes, we have the Donald Trumps, a bad comedian, I think. I don't think he's a politician. But, I think we have the, and as Professor Trump said, it's at this context of where we find ourselves, it's really about identifying what it means to have the American dream. And it's definitely the power of stories that challenges the contradictions, that challenges the others, right? The rhetoric of the others that many of these extreme politicians really adopt. So for me, one of the things that I do believe very strongly is the ability to tell our stories. It's easy to point the fingers and say the others, the faceless, the people taking our jobs. But when I confront people and said, well, listen, I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to the same high school that Senator Chuck Schumer went to, and now presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, the feel the burn, people. You know, it's, you know, I am a New Yorker. This is my home. I love being Mexican. I love the Mexican culture. I love Mexican food. I'm sure many people love Mexican food. But, you know, it's about adopting our stories and owning our stories, not letting others define us. Because when we let others define us and our stories, it's when we crash into the contradictions. We crash into a lawyer, but someone who's not supposed to be here.
Do you work as a lawyer?
Well, you know, I think when I graduated law school in 2011, I didn't know whether I was going to be a lawyer because of my immigration status. I didn't have work authorization. I technically, you know, I shouldn't be here, so I couldn't work. And I was, you know, I was like, crap, you know, what's next? What's next? And for me, I think it was, you know what? If there's something I do know, is my commitment to make my mom proud. Because the reason I went to college, the reason I went to law school, was to fulfill not my American dream, but the American dream of my mother. And I was going to do everything that I could to become a lawyer, a licensed lawyer, but I was going to make sure that I was going to confront elected officials, politicians, Democrats and Republicans, to remind them that their job was to serve our community and to pass immigration reform that's going to protect our families.
So if we could focus on some of the numbers, Professor Tran, when there are a lot of proposals right now that suggest that there may be something other than a full citizenship that immigrants should embrace as a temporary measure. When you think about these notions of a second-class citizenship, is it viable? Is it offensive? Is it even something we should be considering?
So let me just say that right now we have 11 undocumented migrants among us, living in the shadows of our society and the margins of our society. These are the people like Cesar, who basically have been here for most of their life, and the only crime or violation that they committed was the fact that they were brought to the United States by their parents when they were very young. They have no legal right, and they have very few civil rights and civil protections. And in fact, in no other point in our recent history do we have a population the size of 11 million living on the other side of the law. And again, our choice is clear. And on this, I am on the side of there's only one citizenship criterion. These people should be given a path to naturalization, and I don't think we should even accept, you know, the idea of second-class citizen as a possibility. The reason for this is rather complex, but I'll just highlight two, okay? One is that for much of our history, the border itself is an idea that is very, very porous. And in fact, I cannot do justice to this because, you know, you need a lecture of 90 minutes for why we get ourselves into the current situation in the first place. And it comes back to NAFTA 1994 when we decided that we want the integration of basically the market for Mexico, the United States, and Canada. At the same time, we said we don't want those people to cross our border. We only want integration of market, technology, goods, and services. And because of that, we have been, over the last 20 years, increasingly made it almost impossible for anyone to cross the Mexico-US border. And of course, we're not talking about the Canadian and US border, but that's a border that is not, in our collective imagination, to borrow your term at the beginning, symbolically important.
So when we talk about those borders, there's a lot of talk about a particular type of immigrant. Do you feel, and I'll address Nagin over here, do you think that there are some immigrants, some countries that have a better time here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, like, no, right, like, you know, like the professor's saying, no one cares about the Canadians. Like, they're not threatening us with their bacon, so.
The maple syrup?
Yeah, they're hockey, but they definitely, it's interesting, like, you know, also what happens with certain immigrant groups, you know, like, I think the richest diaspora community in the United States are the Lebanese. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they've fully integrated. That doesn't mean that they're fully accepted, but they make a lot of money, and so that's interesting. Like that they're able to use, that they're able to benefit from the system. But I don't know that that we've welcomed them. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm not sure. There's definitely like a difference between being a white immigrant and an immigrant of color.
For Cesar, as a lawyer, I wanted you to tackle this question. There was a question submitted by the attendees here about the idea that some non-white groups currently existing in America, are there any programs that should especially benefit them instead of immigrants? Is this an issue that you have come across where someone says, my people have been in this country longer, I'm not white, I face difficulties, why should I lend my strength to your struggle when I can't feed my family?
Well, it goes back to a simple principle, right? Divide and conquer. When you actually are trying to pit two groups against each other, for example, perfect example, Donald Trump did that in Arizona. Just when he had a campaign rally, right? He actually put forward a African American father whose son was killed by an undocumented immigrant, and he used very clearly, the kind of like they should not support them because they are killing them or they are robbing or whoever. So it's a very effective strategy to divide and say, let's divide these groups. But when it comes to immigration, when it comes to the ability of criminalizing communities of color, we get to understand that there is similar programs, similar strategies to kind of work together. Just the fact that I look brown, let alone that I'm undocumented, I could be stopped by a police officer. Similar, a young black man could, be stopped by the police simply for walking in a neighborhood. So we're talking about the criminalizations of communities of colors that go to the same issue, to a criminal justice system that's also broken, that's also outdated. So, there's various programs out there that I think, we were talking about our friend Jose Antonio Vargas, who also came out publicly as undocumented. He was a journalist at the New York Times and Washington Post, and he just created a movie called Dear White People. And there's this person who pretty much, the student says, what, all these scholarships are going to, black people, to Latino, I don't have a fair shot. But studies show that there is way more scholarships, and white Americans have more scholarships opportunities than Latinos and blacks. So, I think when we put the numbers, it's not to pit even blacks against Latinos or whites against Latinos or white against blacks, but it's about really kind of understanding where we are at. And I think the work that, Professor does in terms of outlining the concrete numbers of where they're using them and how we should actually really understand our stories as Americans versus as black against brown or white against black.
So what I'm hearing when you're saying is that when you are trying to bridge that divide, you focus on the criminal justice system and efforts to criminalize people of color as a way to bridge that gap. Professor Tran, here in New York City, I know your research focuses a lot here in New York City. Are you seeing this? Are both groups sort of affected by the same system, and is that a way to form some sort of unity?
I mean, there's no question that African Americans are significantly more disadvantaged compared to Hispanics and Latinos. That's clear on every single measure. And that has to do with the historical legacy of slavery and the ongoing role of prejudice and discrimination in our society, which unfortunately is still with us today. That said, the Hispanic and Latino community are also rather disadvantaged, and one of the most important ways in which they're disadvantaged is really their undocumented status, less so than any other ways in which they're being kind of criminalized. Because when you think about criminalization of Latinos, take Arizona, for example, right, whereby Latinos are basically profiled in a particular way. There, it is about documented status. Of course, it's about skin color, it's about race, about, every other dimension of difference. But I argue, and I think that this is consistent with the research that you are seeing over the last 15 years, that the undocumented status, the lack of legal status, is the most important dimension of stratification for the Latino population, which often leads to the ongoing racialization process, if you will, among this group. Now, if you could, if I could just take this back a little bit into a broader view, I want to make just 2 quick points. One, 100 years ago, when the Italians and the Jews and the Irish immigrants arrived from Europe, they were seen as A, culturally inferior compared to the WASP mainstream at the time, and B, unassimilable into the mainstream American society. The historical record of that story in 60 seconds is that they are mostly accepted and assimilated, and yet African Americans remain left aside on the margins of our society and was not allowed to even vote until the 1960s. Second point, affirmative action policy at places like Columbia and beyond. It is clear from research by my colleagues, Doug Massey at Princeton and others, that affirmative action policies have increasingly benefited the children of immigrants of color, either African migrants or West Indian migrants, at the expense of African Americans whose parents and grandparents could trace their ancestry back to the historical legacy of
So
slavery.
hold on one second. What are we supposed to do with that fact? Because some people would be really angered by that and say that the whole system should be abolished. Or should we increase it? I mean, how do you negotiate some of the really hard feelings that people have based on the fact that you just shared?
It's not an easy question, and that's why we are having this conversation. Really, it comes down to, is it race or is it class that we're trying to address? And going forward, the role of social class is increasingly important in stratifying our society. Should we take a disadvantaged African American from Harlem, or should we accept a middle class son or daughter of 2 Nigerian physicians from the suburban county of Scarsdale or Westchester? That is the question that the admission office has to face. And it's actually right now, roiling the entire higher education system across the country. And I haven't even said a word about Asian Americans who are basically being arguably disadvantaged, because you look at the SAT scores and whatnot, they are above and beyond the average for a white applicant. So this is a very, very complex set of issues. And I think that I would come down on the side that we need holistic admission, and however we define that. And that has to be the guiding principle in terms of how we think about admission. But let me come back to the 30,000 feet one more time, which is, how do we deal with differences between Latinos and blacks? It really comes back to active engagement across those differences. And let me also highlight that in New York City, just to come back to our city for 1 second, we are, as a city, 8 million people, and by and large, we get along harmoniously, blacks and Latinos and Asians and whites. And these are multiple incidents of civility that are happening every day. We have the moments of flare-up of racial riots and whatnot, but by and large, we must not forget that we get along. And those moments of getting along, if you will, really reveal that there is a possibility for inclusion and for something larger than ourselves.
So when we talk about inclusion, one of the things that always seems to be sort of the elephant in the room, when we talk specifically about immigration, aside from Latinos and African Americans, we have Muslims. What place does that fit within this whole notion of, is affirmative action just helping, the children of immigrants or historically disadvantaged groups here in America?
Well, it's actually, I have a question about that statistic. When you break down the fact that affirmative action is benefiting largely first-generation sons and daughters of West Indian and African descent immigrants, of those, are they by and large middle class, or are they? Or do you know the class breakdown?
There's a wide range of variation, but Nigerians, for example, are highly selected. Most of them are PhDs and MDs coming in with a lot of human capital. West Indians are more middling and bimodal in the sense that some of them are working class, some of them are middle class. Mm-hmm. And African Americans, historically, of course, has been rather disadvantaged. And of course, I have to mention the rise of the black middle class and of course the black elites, because we do have a president who is biracial, who's black. So I think the reality of our social life is much more complex than what I could do justice in 30 seconds.
Okay, cool. No, that's that's really, it's funny because this issue has been going on since I went to college, right? And I remember at the time when I was going to college, and I'm from Southern California. I grew up in Palm Springs, a very popular gay and resort town. With senior citizens, I grew up, and I was the only child in my neighborhood playing alone. And I remember that, when I was applying to college, the issue of affirmative action was so huge because everyone just assumed that, that someone like me would get a benefit. But on the other hand, everyone would say, you're not going to get into any schools in Southern California because this is where all the Iranians are, and there are too many Iranians in schools in Southern California, which I wanted to get, I want to get out of there because it is the armpit of America. But I say that with love. And so for me, it was interesting because you can be in one of these other groups, which also don't ever really get categorized. When we have these conversations, it's always like, it's Black, Latino. Asians also rarely, I feel like, enter the discussion, the race discussion. And then there's like the whole slew of absolutely everybody else, your Indians, your Iranians, your Saudis, your whatever, that are also, that are now, I'm first generation, building, a real population here, a real American identity here. So I feel like, there's both the benefit of, you came in with maybe educated parents and are able to kind of like enter the American dream with greater ease, but at the same time, you might be barred from actually, in the case where people would, when guidance counselor said to me, oh, you're not, it's going to be very tough for you to get into schools, because you're Iranian. Iranians like get into, all of the Southern California school, or, there's too many of them. And so that became a very troubling, and at the same time, as a liberal, I thought, well, I did have advantages, and I don't deserve to get some of these spots. I just don't. I have advantages. I will make do in a way that someone else, And I was saying, like, I went to a high school that was 60% Mexican, and I went to undergrad in upstate New York at Cornell, where there were like no Mexicans, and I was shocked. Because I had grown up with like a certain foundation of seeing Mexicans every day, and I was like, where are all the I'm uncomfortable, and it was weird for me that such a small number of people from my high school ended up going to the schools that I went to. So I don't know.
You don't know. But you posed a good question. Where are all the Mexicans? So we turn to Cesar over here.
She looked at me.
When you talk to folks who are undocumented students, do you think that your presence gives them hope, or is there a little bit of sadness because you are living this American dream? You went to the schools, you got a law degree, and yet you're still facing these challenges. What do you say to these dreamers who want to graduate from school, but they are afraid they may find themselves in a situation that you're in right now?
Well, I definitely hope that, through my story, that it can definitely inspire young people to, whether undocumented or not undocumented, to really kind of see that it is possible, and obviously with the support of so many people. I got here not because it was just me and I did this all by myself. The individualistic kind of idea of like, there's this guy who did everything. Absolutely not. I definitely owe the success to my family and to so many professors, deans, administrators who got me where I am now. So I do hope to do that, because for me, I was inspired to go to college. I was inspired to go to law school because I did see other dreamers who were on television fighting for their education. They were getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. from Arizona, from Texas, from Georgia, Alabama, really heading out to Washington, D.C. and fighting for the education. And for me, I remember looking at on the TV and saying to myself, you know what? I can't be on the sidelines anymore. I need to do my part. I need to, make sure that I make whatever effort that I can to contribute this, to make sure that if other people see me or other people see the team that I work with, that they can say, you know what? I also want to get involved. And on social media, I've been receiving Facebook messages, Twitter, of people saying, I want to go to law school. I want to apply to law school. I want to be the first undocumented immigrant to be admitted as a lawyer in Alabama, in South Carolina. And, I was like, well, you definitely got a lot of work to do in Alabama and in South Carolina. But, I think it's really cool to see how, for me, I'm a very strong believer of the power of stories. Numbers are very significant because they inform us, but stories really touch the minds and hearts. And I think it really allows us to echo that energy throughout the country and throughout, social media. So I do hope that my story does inspire, because I know that other people inspire me to where I am at this point.
So in 5 minutes, we're going to open up the floor to question. But before we do that, I want each of you to sort of briefly answer this question. What is the most difficult part of what you are doing to advance the cause of immigration and belonging? And really think critically about that, because a lot of folks are wondering right here, what can I do? But there is a darker, uglier side of it. So what is the more difficult part? Can we start with Professor Tran?
Well, I guess as a professor, I'm here to educate. And I think getting the facts right, both historically and contemporarily, is so crucial. So there's a lot of misperceptions out there, and I'll just address two in the interest of time. One, the record is clear, and this is summarized in the most recent publication on the integration of immigrants into American society that was published just 2 weeks ago by the National Academy of Sciences. The result of basically 2 years of work by a team of sociologists, political scientists, and anthropologists. The record is clear. Immigrants and their children are integrating into American society at a recordly quick pace. They're learning English by the second generation, they're working, they're doing good work every day, and they're contributing, and they're wanting to become Americans, desperately wanting to become Americans. So our fears and concerns about immigration, bringing crime, bringing drugs, bringing rapists, to just paraphrase Donald Trump for a second, is just so unfounded. And yet, at the national level, we have a Republican primary that is pandering to this fear-mongering fact. And as a nation, we sit watching that unfolding. And as a social scientist, I think to myself, who are these people? Don't you recognize what I already know? Am I doing something wrong in not communicating what I know to you? And that's why you could walk around thinking and telling and retelling these lies and half-truths. And then there's a part of me that thought, well, who are these people? I want to know where they are, why they are thinking the way they are. And they are in Iowa and Ohio and Nebraska. And as a social scientist, I wanted to say, I need to go and meet these people and talk to them and see how did they think the way they do. Because I think it's more complex than that which we make it out to be. And immigration often invokes strong emotions, especially because of the lack of familiarity with immigrants and their children. So in New York, this is not a problem. But in other places where immigration is a rare phenomenon, it is indeed a problem, and we should not make light of it. And we should, at the very least, begin a conversation as to why people behave the way they do. And that understanding will yield insights into how we can change hearts and mind through either comedy or activism.
We want to turn to the comedian over here. The most difficult part of what you do, and he mentioned, have you met those people who are opposed to the fact that you are actually here?
Oh, yeah. I've been told to go back to my own country multiple times. Was born here. But I think in terms of what's the most difficult thing, and I use social justice comedy to fight for a lot of stuff, I'm from Citizens United, healthcare reform, whatever. But when it comes to bigotry and Islamophobia, it's really, for me, it's about community building, right? Because I found, when I rounded up my Muslim American comedians in a nonviolent way, and we went around the country to do these shows, right? To do stand-up in places like, in Arizona, in Mississippi, in Georgia, places where they love the Muzzies,
Never
it
heard
was...
the Muzzies before.
Hashtag. And the idea was to meet these people, right? And to build community with these people. And one of my favorite theorists is a dude named Robert Putnam out of Harvard, who doesn't have their favorite theorist. And he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He has a newer one that came out recently. And in it, he talks about the kind of like fraying bonds of community. We don't have bowling leagues anymore. We don't have the 4-H club anymore. So all of these things that kind of used to keep us together have sort of fallen apart. And so, and it's left us with more fringe identities, like not a great sense of community bonding. And I think the biggest challenge, especially with the kinds of cities that we have, where everyone's in their own silos, where everyone's in their own cars, driving from one part of town to another part of town, in only places where they feel comfortable. How do you step out of your comfort zone to build community with someone who you don't know, who you're not comfortable with? And I think, and every time I do it, on camera and in my personal life, it's like I have to take a moment because I'm walking into what could be the lion's den, and and I'm just like, all right, let's go do it, and that feeling of just like, all right, let's go do it, where you don't know if someone's going to tell you to go back to your own country or whatever. They're going to be mad. Have I been chased down a hill with a stick in Tennessee? Yes, I have. That stuff is scary, but I think summoning that energy to go speak to people, and 99% of the time, because being chased around by a stick, it does happen, and that's the off chance that'll happen is what makes the stuff kind of scary. But it makes you dump your pants. But what really happens most of the time, if you're really out there to try and build community with love, if you approach it with love, you get love in return, and that's what I found. So that's been the hardest part, is how to get through.
So we turn to Cesar now. The hardest part of what you do. Have you been chased around with a stick, like in the game?
In Lakeland, Florida. So I think to answer that question. So I think the biggest challenge for the activism, the advocacy that we do, is about confronting power. In this past January, I was in Iowa, a very small town in Iowa, that they held the Freedom Summit for Republican presidential candidates to talk about the, whatever, and Sarah Palin was there, Donald Trump was there, you name it, the whole circus was there. But we went there and we went to confront them and to talk about who we were, to challenge them on their immigration platforms, to challenge them on everything that they are pretty much wrong about. And we were able to get inside. I was arrested for trespassing because, apparently they don't like, they're okay with other people clapping, but they're not okay with me asking them questions about their immigration stances. So, I was escorted and arrested for trespasses. But, in social media and I got, calls and text messages from members of Congress, local allies. They were like, yeah, great, you're challenging, Donald Trump, you're challenging these people. But when it comes to challenging our own allies, when it comes to challenging the Democratic Party, when it comes to challenging President Obama, people all of a sudden were like, what are you doing? He's your friend, he's your ally, don't, go after the bad people. But we told them, listen, President Obama has deported over 2 million people, families. From 1894 to 1997, the U.S. deported 2.1 million people. In 100 years, 2 million people. President Obama did this in 6 years. Over 1,100 people being deported every day. And we heard those stories of a mother who saw the child being arrested. We saw a Marine in Ohio whose husband was deported at the same time that she was going to give birth. So, we are hearing those stories, and when we challenge Democrats and when we challenge our allies, we're telling them this. Yeah, of course, yes, their political beliefs align more with us, and for me, I'm a supporter of President Obama, and I helped campaign in 2008, 2012, because I did believe that he was the best candidate. But my loyalty lies in my family, in my community, and in my country, not a political party. And when it comes to challenging power, it's easy to challenge your political opponents, but very, very hard to challenge your political allies. So for me, let's not get caught up with all the Hillary fanfare. Let's not get caught up with all the Bernie fanfare. Let's challenge them. Black Lives Matter has done this very well. We have done this, because for me, my loyalty lies with my community, not a political party, not a fancy gal in Washington, D.C.
Very strong words, challenging your allies. But I want to make sure that we have time for everyone here. At this point, I'd like people who want to ask questions to line up the mic, and you can ask the panelists questions. We're going to get about 5 questions or so. I want you to first ask them, and then I'll summarize them so they can answer in the interest of time.
Hi, thank you for coming. This has been a really wonderful panel. I'm Sarah. I'm a journalism student studying immigration. Mayor de Blasio's office just announced increased access for undocumented immigrants for health care. And I was wondering, some cities have been doing this, San Francisco, Boston. Do you think a city-by-city approach to problems like access to health care and education will change the national conversation in favor of immigrants eventually?
We'll go to the next question.
Hi, thank you for the engaging conversation. My name is Angela Afa. I'm a social work student, and I work with Professor Tran as well. My question is about, I guess, to Professor Tran and Mr. Vargas. What is the experience in terms of engaging other immigrant groups? Has it been easy? And when I say that, I mean that, the discussion is always focused on the Latino group. But like you mentioned before, Professor Tran, we have the African, the Asian as well. What has your experience been? And then Professor Tran, how do you see in terms, is it an issue of mobilization? That is it easier to mobilize the Latinos as opposed to the other immigrant groups?
Hi, my name is Max. I am a junior in CC. This question is more for Nagin, but if you guys want to weigh in too, when you look at comedians like Dave Chappelle and Richard Pryor, there's really a lot of things, and like The Daily Show and Stephen Colbert too, there's so many ways you can talk about political issues like race and immigration with comedy. But I want to know if obviously there's a lot of strengths to comedy, but what are the potential weaknesses, and are there certain topics that, either it's more difficult to discuss, or you actually can't discuss using comedy? So.
Hi, my name is Kira. I'm a journalism student as well. Thanks for coming. And I was wondering if, for all three of you, if you could talk about the role you see that journalists could play in kind of advancing these discussions, and what you would change about the coverage of these conversations.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm a Bridge to PhD program scholar here at Columbia. I'm also undocumented, and I have a question about how do we, as a university, combine programs like the Bridge to PhD program, combine, for example, the Facebook group, Class Confessions, and other things that the university can do. What are ideas you guys have for more support from the university for undocumented students, or Black, Latino, Asian students, and what are the challenges to actually making those things happen?
So we have a couple of themes here in these questions, some for specific members, but just generally speaking, how do you engage different groups who may have competing interests, and what should journalists do in order to tell the story that advances the cause? Or should personally I would say tell the story as it is rather than with any agenda, but you guys are not journalists. So from your perspective, how do you do that?
For me, it's definitely very, we have been making progress because, when we are seeing a lot of the advocacy, on television, it's mostly Latino, marches in California and all those places. But I think for me, the biggest challenge has been is the cultural differences. For example, when we are approaching young Asians, Koreans, or other undocumented groups, they have a culture of some people telling the parents saying, don't, it's a shame to say that you're undocumented, don't do it. Similar with the African immigrant community, for example, on Staten Island, it's very challenging to kind of, break out of that tradition. But there's definitely has been progress made where we're working with different immigrant communities. But the other thing too, we have been working very closely as well with Native American communities. I think the Native American groups have been very, very amazing allies. For example, in Arizona, the tribe, I forgot the name of the tribe, but when Arizona introduced and passed that legislation, the Papers, Please law, the Arizona reservations of the Indian tribes, they refused to enforce them. They're like, nope, over here, we're going to welcome everyone. So that was really cool on that. But in terms of just quickly on reporters, I do believe that challenging. I don't know if you all saw like all the journalist students where Jorge Ramos confronted Donald Trump. That, he was asking tough questions, and obviously it's Donald Trump. But I do think that asking those tough questions and bringing those stories does have an impact of how you tell the stories of people versus, Fox News or Newsmax versus, other publications.
And can I just weigh in? Actually, Arizona is such a great example of how important allyship is. And when I was in Arizona, first of all, there are Iranians that have been stopped because of SB 1070. They probably think that they're Mexican, but either way. So the funny thing is that there's a slippery. This is a slippery slope. One, a rule like SB 1070, while on the face of it is kind of geared towards Mexican immigrants, it's geared toward every immigrant. So we need to kind of work together on issues like that. And when I was in Arizona, we went to Nogales with a local immigrant rights group, and we were both detained at the border, which is ridiculous. We were all citizens being detained, but so I think it became very, very clear to me in a case like Arizona, especially in certain places, parts of the country, how important it is for these groups and how important it is for like Native American tribes to join together, because these issues, it's just 1 degree of difference for something like SB 1070 to affect Mexicans, and then it'll affect members of Asian communities. It'll affect so there's really no difference between us there on any of those laws.
Professor Tran, I have a specific question for you, but did you want to answer generally?
Sure. Let me just say a word about journalism. And there are 2 things I would say. One, we need you to get the stories out there. The facts are clear. I just told you the facts. But I need you to communicate that to the general public, because I don't have that power. I'm not trained in that way. I could try to write an op-ed, but I'm also busy teaching and writing my book. So we need you. Second, what journalists do not do enough and often is not reporting on the moments of good news. And this is to paraphrase Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, right? Because journalism is about reporting about the issues, the problems. But when there are these wonderful moments of harmony across ethnic and racial groups, we don't hear about them. And therefore the perception in the media has always been that Latinos are overwhelming our borders, the Central Americans are coming across the Mexico-US border, creating crises. In fact, in the front page of the New York Times yesterday was this video documentary of the American migrant crisis. That's the title. It is a crisis in one way, but think about it in a different way. It is also a search for livelihood for these young Hondurans, mostly men, who basically had nothing going for them back in their home country, and therefore they are fleeing to come here despite risking their life, crossing thousands of miles with $8 in their pocket. And these are 16-year-old, younger than probably all of us in this room. Think about that. Secondly, on the questions of engagement, my philosophy has always been that small changes can make a big difference. And by that I mean engagement on a small scale, one-on-one, every day. How often do we look at our students and say, where are you from? Tell me your story, because if I were to ask all of you, every one of you has a unique story as to how you get here. One of the students who asked the question was undocumented. When we think about the undocumented, we often think about them, but they're not them, they are us. They're here in our classrooms, in our dorms, in our residence hall, in our cafeteria. And when we think about the undocumented as us, I don't think we could think about them in the ways that we often do, which is that the criminals, we need to deport them. This is us. And I think those small changes could shift the mindset and create better opportunities for engagement. And I am on for that type of one-on-one change. That's just my philosophy.
So Nagin, I want to make sure that we address the issue really directly, because the fact that you are a comedian, social justice, is really intriguing to folks. There was a question that was asked. There are a lot of comedians out there. Do you think that some of this comedy falls on deaf ears, or do you think it can be hurtful, or do you think it's all positive? How do you address this issue?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's funny because just today I got tweets after, because the case was announced last night. I got a whole bunch of tweets from people being like, yeah, just so you know, we're going to start drawing the Prophet Muhammad because comedy is allowed and we can make comedic Prophet Muhammad. And I was, to that, I shrugged because I don't personally care if anyone draws a Prophet Muhammad. Like, that's like a thing that's important for some, Muslims who are, I don't even think that they number in the United States among secular or moderate or whatever Muslims. And so it's sort of like it's just sort of like taking this way to be like, oh yeah, if you think comedy is legal, then we'll show you. And it's just sort of like, so there's this weird, but P.S. I'm totally a huge fan of the First Amendment, and I think that like if you want to use the First Amendment for hate speech, super into it. Like, go for it. Love the First Amendment. Want to have a bunch of the First Amendment's babies. So I will protect it, and I will protect your right to, draw the Prophet Muhammad because you have the right to. Great, go for it. Also, I will tell jokes. You know what I mean? And then we'll both do the thing. I think what's difficult in this space is we were at a point with, I think we are at a point now with representations of, African Americans where you cannot show them, as coons, as Sambos, whatever, or Jewish people, the hook-nosed Jew, like those things, we do not accept them in the cultural space. You cannot represent them that way. You cannot make those kinds of jokes. It is not appropriate anymore. And that is a cultural win. You know what I mean? That's not, that there are no laws on drawing, a hook-nosed Jew. We have not gotten there yet with Islamophobia. We've not gotten there yet with Muslims. We need to get there with Muslims. We need to make it to a point where it's not okay to only represent Muslims as dusty-faced terrorists roaming the desert. It is not okay every time we talk about Muslims to only show them, in a state of constant prayer. When we talk about Christians, we do not show mega churches. That is not something we do. It's not appropriate. It doesn't reflect all Christians. So we need to have that cultural shift with Muslims, and I think we can get there. And I think we can do that through comedy. And sometimes, I have a joke about how I dated a Jewish man, and I liken it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's my sexual habits are in an effort to help the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And anyways, in this joke, I've had people come up to me and tell me I'm anti-Semitic. I'm obviously not, if I'm in the boudoir, but that's, I think those are moments, and I experience this a lot, where people are not seeing the joke, and that's always a danger with comedy, because sometimes people are not seeing the joke. We're not making direct statements, we're making a lot of satirical statements, and that's why it's funny, and if you don't get it, then it's too bad. I think, though, that the real benefit is that what happens with comedy is that your heart is open. You laugh at something, and the average person does get the joke, and the average person laughs, and in that moment, they have this accidental heart opening, and you can go ahead and stuff in your messages of delight, and that might affect them. And it affects them because they're unknowingly open to it. And that's why it's so powerful.
On that note, since we're on the topic, do you find that you have ever had an especially great amount of freedom as a comedian? Is there anything you ever said that you wouldn't say straight-faced? For you? No.
Is there anything I've ever said that I wouldn't say straight-faced?
Yeah, but your special, space as a comedian.
I think it just gives me so much more. Like, speaking, at the Columbia School of Journalism, a very esteemed institution, and I just talked about boning a Jewish dude. And I think that because I'm a comedian, you're not booting me off the stage. You know what I mean? And so I think that it just gives me an incredible amount of freedom to say so much. And I also think because I'm, representing such a small minority group in the United States, my vantage point on American society is different, and I'm seeing a lot that maybe is a blind spot for a lot of people. And I feel like, does that mean, because I could just be like, yo, like, white guys listen to Dave Matthews too much, and I'm fine with saying like that, and it's okay, or whatever it is. I think I can like target the kind of majority without feeling worried about it. That makes sense.
What about you, Cesar? I keep on harping on the fact that you're undocumented because it's really significant. One, you're openly undocumented. You are working towards a goal. You were a lawyer. Do you have certain freedoms? I mean, you're exercising a lot of strength that some people would be really afraid to do.
Well, for me, it's, if my mom can come across the desert at night with 4 little children, anything could have happened. She could have been killed, raped, her kids could have been kidnapped. If she can do that, I can definitely go and challenge politicians. And for me, it really boils down to, I am an American. I am, that's who I am. I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Brooklyn guy, and I have a New York attitude, and I'm gonna make sure that everyone knows this. But most importantly, I think for me, it's when, when I went back to at the beginning about citizenship. For me, the reason that I am moved forward is because I do want to obtain citizenship, but I also want to obtain a citizenship that does not mean that I want to obtain a citizenship that means, literally equality, opportunity for everyone, not just for undocumented, for Latinos, but for everyone, for all students to have the opportunity to go to college, for all, all families to be able to have healthcare. So that's the citizenship I'm fighting for, a citizenship that I want to make sure that we all have that freedom to be Americans and proud, and that we all have the opportunity, not just one against the other. So for me, I think that is the most important, that I am an American, so I'm going to make sure that I tell everyone who I am.
I wanted to inject one question that was brought up by our guest here. You mentioned you're a Brooklyn guy, a New York guy, and you're an expert on cities. Can a national issue be solved city by city with the efforts that the de Blasio administration is having with some of the other large cities? Is that possible?
So my feeling about this is that it starts with cities and state at the local level. So New York, for example, is a great example of how welcoming we have been towards everyone, and especially the undocumented. You go to the city government, the Office for New Immigrants, they will say that, well, everyone who walks through our door, we do not ask them about their documented status because we care deeply about making sure that all New Yorkers are being helped and are being served. So that is a model, if you will, of civility and inclusion that other cities should follow. On the second level, I think that, again, big changes happen with very, very small beginnings. Take the issue of same-sex marriage. It began in a few states. Massachusetts was the first one in 2004 to allow same-sex marriage. And now the national conversation has shifted. So I don't see anything wrong at all with beginning very small at the local levels, and then the minds and hearts of those who are not here in New York or San Francisco and Boston will be changed, shall be changed, because we have the opportunities to highlight the stories that are forthcoming from these very local settings.
Again, you want to answer that?
I want to respond to I just want to mention also, because I don't remember what the question was.
City by city. So can this national
right.
problem be handled city by city? You go on tour, you're dealing with small groups.
Yeah.
Does that work?
So I think, the question for me is not necessarily city by city, but it's cultural versus political. And, and I think you bring up a really great point in terms of, the gay rights movement and same-sex marriage, which is, I don't think that we would be fooling ourselves if we thought that Ellen DeGeneres and Will and Grace didn't have anything to do with it. You know what I mean? We brought really, positive, fun representatives of the gay community into people's living rooms to the point where my mom loved, Jack on Will and Grace. You know what I'm saying? And that is a really big part of how culture can shift politics. And so I think that is how I view my role as a comedian, and how I view the responsibility that a lot of you are, for those of you who become journalists, I mean, you're going to be part of networks and institutions who do have a responsibility to say, okay, how are we going to bring, when it comes to narrative material, how are we going to represent people of color in these shows? Because that is what Americans end up knowing about people of color. So, and that is, how we can see shifts in the political and legal realm.
And I think it's very significant. We have had great change from the state level, whether it's the LGBT marriage issue to women's suffrage. It started at the very state level, to local localities providing IDs. But it's also, that's why it shows the significance of being actively involved in local city elections, or local politics, because it's easy to get involved in the presidential election, the U.S. Senate election. But just as we have great victories at the local level, at the very local level, we also have voter ID laws, right, that are popping up all over the country. We have, Arizona localities introducing legislation that, criminalizes pretty much, you have to have your papers, right? So, we also show how, on the other side of the spectrum, how localities can also be used to kind of introduce very, laws and policies that really are undermining our liberties and the Constitution.
So as we're winding down to our last few minutes, I wanted each of you very, very briefly, we're talking about 15, 20 seconds, what is the thought that you want to leave everyone with? We can start here, or we can start over there.
I want all of us to create a culture of inclusion at Columbia, such that we'll create spaces for conversations that are meaningful and engaging, that we're not afraid of topics that could be potentially divisive, that we're thoughtful in how we engage with each other every day on our campus, lingering a bit longer, looking someone longer into the eyes, asking questions, finding answers. I also want us to create a space where students from every single ethno-racial, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds feel that they're part of Columbia, that they are us, that first-generation students who are here for the first time, whose parents were agricultural workers from Mexico or undocumented, could come to us and say, I'm undocumented, and I want to tell you because I believe that you shall be there to support me. Or I'm gay or transgender or bisexual and whatnot, and I want you to know because that is an important dimension of my identity, and you should take it seriously and not judge me for whom I am. I want a Columbia that is more inclusive than ever before so that we could cope with the tremendous diversity that our student body brings to us and our city puts in front of us every day, such that 50 years from now, we won't be having this conversation, and we'll be having a different conversation about the legacy that our generation has left behind here at Columbia and beyond. That is what I hope to do with everything that we do here. And certainly, I think this is a mission that Professor Goldberg and the Office of University Life hopes to accomplish in the coming years as well.
Magee?
When you leave Columbia, and just piggybacking off of something that Professor Tran said earlier, I think it's about finding people on the other side of town, going bowling with them and getting drunk with them, and maybe going home with them. You know what I'm saying? Like whatever we can do to kind of build a bridge between people we are not necessarily comfortable with or aren't necessarily immediately in our friend group, aren't immediately in our socioeconomic class, aren't immediately in our racial group. Once we can build that community, I mean, so many of our problems will seep away. I really think it's that simple.
And for me, simply is challenge your allies. I can't emphasize that enough because we need to make sure that we are reminding our elected officials, our administrators, our own friends to really take us and value who we are. Because especially at the political level, it's easy for politicians to take a certain group of voters for granted because they know, oh, they're already on our side. We don't even need to talk to them. We don't even need to sit down with them. And young people, like, yeah, the young people are with us. Let's go talk to someone else. So, challenge your allies, because when we challenge, our allies, it's easy to challenge political opponents. But when we challenge our allies, they're reminded that the power resides in us, and the power really resides in the people. As simple as that sounds. So for me, it's challenge your allies. Especially as 2016 comes around, that's going to be even more important, more than ever.
The power resides in the people. Now, if you want to know more about our panelists, visit the website, universitylife.columbia.edu. Reminder that the next event is November 5th, Awakening Our Democracy. One more round of applause. Excellent discussion. Thank you very much.